I wanted to showcase a project that I recently completed. My very first arcade stick. While I have completed several arcade builds before, like my Magneto cabinet, my NES bar top, and my 4-player X-Men cab, I'd never actually built a standalone arcade stick. There's quite a big difference in skill and construction methods between these projects. Where the much smaller arcade stick requires more accurate woodworking, as any and all mistakes or inaccuracies would immediately stand out. On the plus side, it took way less time to complete. Roughly 5 weekends versus the typical long year time it takes me to build a full size cabinet. Another big change for me for this project was that I used real wood for the first time. Oak in this case. Previously, I had always used MDF or plywood for my projects. And working with actual wood is quite different from working with artificial wood. Not least because real wood does not want to stay flat. But otherwise, it's much more rewarding to work with. At least, that's my opinion. Overall, though, I'm super happy with the results and think the stick looks absolutely gorgeous. It works great, is comfortable to use, plus that oiled oak feels super nice to the touch. So for the joystick, yeah, I really like the Saimitsu LS58 that I used in my X-Men build, but I really disliked how loud it was. Luckily, these days Saimitsu sells the Cell 70XS, which is pretty close to a silent version of the before mentioned Saimitsu LS58. This stick also comes with a height adjustable shaft and it doesn't rotate during gameplay. And I paired this joystick with a Sanwa LB35 ball top in color gunmetal. Nice and shiny looking. For the action buttons, I opted for the Saimitsu PS14GN 30mm screw-in buttons, and for the option buttons, I went with the smaller Saimitsu PS14D 24 snap-in buttons, all in black, to keep the minimalistic sleek look of the arcade stick. Now, I used these same buttons in my Magneto cabinet before and had no complaints. Then I used the standard Neutric USB pass-through, which is a reversible USB A to B adapter. I've used them on all my builds before, and they're super reliable and really easy to mount. Yeah, next up is the GP2040 CE, which is like a fight board and acts as the beating heart of the arcade stick. So initially I was looking at the Brooks Gaming fight board, fighting board series, but I found it kind of hard and confusing to find out what the differences are between the various models they sell and whether I should actually care about those differences. And then I learned about an open hardware alternative to it called the GP2040. Yeah, and this is, well, if you look at the more higher end Brook Gaming fighting board series products, you're looking at close to €100. And this GP2040 is like a far cheaper option in that sense. And after like checking it out, it did do everything that I wanted from my fight board. So I went with that. And finally, I noticed that the fight board supports hooking up a small OLED screen with a maximum resolution of 128 by 64 pixels. And so this screen can be used to check settings and diagnose issues. It sounded kind of cool, but not something I would like to spend a lot of money on. But looking around, yeah, you can buy them for like $6. So I felt it was cheap enough to just buy and try it out. In terms of design goals, I had only a few. It had to work on the Nintendo Switch, the PC, and Mr. FPGA. And anything beyond that would be, well, I would consider it a nice bonus, but not mandatory. The main use case will be shoot 'em ups, and next to that, but to a far lesser extent, beat 'em ups. I wanted a clean and clutter-free look, a simple construction method, meaning it's easy to build and hard to mess up that building process. And I want it to be made out of wood. As always, I use SketchUp to work out the design. For the dimensions, I settled on a width of 40 centimeters, a depth of 24 centimeters, and a height of 5.4 centimeters. The width actually comes from the wood I bought. I noticed that a local shop was selling 18mm thick wooden furniture panels. The oak panels look really nice, so I ended up buying a 100-meter long, 40-centimeter wide oak panel. In terms of height, I feel lower is better, but obviously the joystick requires a certain amount of clearance underneath. In trying to keep the build simple, I decided to stack 3 panels on top of each other and glue them together. This results in 3 times 18mm or 5.4 centimeters of height. This gives me plenty of room to undermount the joystick. Going with this approach, I only needed to make 3 cuts along the width of the oak panel, thus simplifying the build process a lot. The 20cm depth was obtained by printing out several panel layouts to scale, putting these on top of my desk and placing my hands on them to see which layout I liked the most. Then I looked at how much additional space I wanted for my palms to rest on and how much I felt I needed to achieve a visual overall balance. These example panel layouts can all be found on the website Slackcoin. And as you can see, there's quite a large selection of them. I settled on the Sega layout for player 2, and like most layouts, this one comes with alternative locations for the joysticks and the 2 rightmost buttons. I opted for moving the stick further away from the buttons to the leftmost position, as this felt most comfortable for me. With the basic dimensions and panel layout decided, it's time to design the inside layout of the stick, taking into account how to mount all the arcade parts. For stability or strength of the arcade stick, I wanted to go with 2 compartments, one compartment for the joystick and the other one for the buttons and controller board. Space-wise, I opted to place the OLED display in the joystick compartment, as that had plenty of space left. As cables will need to run between these 2 compartments, I added 2 small holes or channels to accommodate this. The Famitsu screw-in buttons can only be mounted in panels up to 12mm of thickness, meaning I will need to remove some wood underneath using a router to get a thickness of about 10mm. The Famitsu joystick ideally has 23 to 24mm of space between the top of the panel and the bottom of the ball top. I felt I needed at least 10mm of thickness for screws to undermount the joystick plate, and taking the shaft length and thickness of the spacers into account, I calculated a joystick mounting depth of 12mm, which would require me to use both spacers. Lastly, I'll use transparent plexiglass for the bottom, in a thickness of 3mm, which is thick and strong enough for this use case. And this will again require some routing to make it flush with the bottom plate. And now with the design finalized, it's time to start on the woodworking. I started with the top panel that I cut from the oak furniture board with a track saw. I then used the Phillips screwdriver and a hammer to mark the center points of the button and joystick locations. And then I used Frosner bits to cut these holes. I then flipped the board and marked the areas where I would need to remove wood with the router, as well as how much wood I would need to remove. Around the buttons, I just freehanded the router, because it doesn't matter if you're not accurate there. For the joystick though, I wanted the base plate to be, to have a very tight fit. So what I did was I used double-sided tape and some spare pieces of wood to essentially lay out where the hole should come. And then using a router, I essentially copied that shape onto the top panel. And as you can see, that worked really well and gave a very nice result. But router bits always have rounded corners, so then I used the chisel to square them out so that the joystick baseplate actually fit. And that's pretty much it for the top panel. Moving on to the middle panel, where I marked down the 2 compartments and did a rough cut of them with the jigsaw. Then cleaned those up using the router, using the same approach as for the joystick. And the results are pretty good. I also use the router to create the two channels to allow cables to move from one compartment to the other one. With the middle panel done, it's time to glue it to the top panel using a lot of clamps. Moving on to the bottom panel, I first wanted to route away the 3mm of wood for the plexiglass. Unfortunately, I ran out of double-sided tape, so I had to get creative in building a frame, along which the router bit could run. For this, I again used a flush trim router bit with a top pilot bearing. I got too absorbed in the work I was doing that I forgot to take any pictures. But the next steps were very similar to the middle panel, meaning marking the two compartments and doing a rough cut of these with the jigsaw, after which I glued the bottom panel to the arcade stick. Using a flush router bit with a bottom pilot bearing, I copied the holes of both compartments from the middle panel onto the bottom panel. When you look at the picture, you will notice that I made an immensely stupid mistake. I glued the bottom panel upside down and only noticed while the glue was drying. I tried to pull off the panel, but it was too late as I used fast drying wood glue. So now there's this 3mm slot on the inside instead of at the bottom. Oh well. With all three panels glued though, it's time to take a step back and appreciate the design of the arcade stick taking form. Continuing, I used a spare piece of plywood and made 4 cuts with the track saw, essentially creating a window frame. I clamped this to the bottom of the arcade stick and ran a flush trim bit along the inside to route out the 3mm required for the plexiglass. Quite happy with the results here. I ran a roundover bit along the edges of the front and back to create smooth curves, and I marked the drill locations for the USB pass-through and the 4 options buttons on the back of the arcade stick. Before drilling those holes, I cut a small strip out of a 3mm MDF backing board and forced that into the slot. Then I clamped a spare piece of wood on the inside to prevent any tear out happening during the drilling process. After a lot of sanding, the woodworking is pretty much done. Now it's time to oil the stick, for which I used Osmo Top Oil, 2 layers of 3068 Natural, followed by 2 layers of 3028 Clear Satin, with 24 hours of drying time between each layer. This is a very fulfilling step in the building process as oiled wood looks and feels amazing. All that is left now is the installation and wiring of the parts. I used 10mm M3 PCB standoffs for the GP2040. The 2mm holes I drilled for these had to be really accurate as otherwise the PCB holes won't line up properly. For the OLED display I had to use smaller but taller 20mm M2.5 PCB standoffs. The holes on this PCB are absolutely tiny, plus the connector pins stick out the back, requiring at least 50mm of clearance. I also had a plexiglass cut, which ended up having a pretty much perfect fit. I drilled all the holes to mount the plexiglass, making sure that the holes through the plexiglass were wider than the thickness of the screws I would be using, and I countersunk them sometime after that. I installed all the buttons and screwed the joystick in place. Now it was time to start wiring up all the controls. Luckily, I still had a ton of wire and crimps left from previous build, so did not have to buy anything for this. I often read that people dislike this part, but I find it quite relaxing to do. I put up some music and get lost in the repeated act of measuring, cutting and crimping. Starting with the joystick compartment, I used thin black wire, daisy chained for the grounding, and blue wire for the directional inputs. For the main compartment, I used red wire for the top row and green for the bottom row of action buttons. Yellow wire for the option buttons, start, home and select. And finally a single white wire for the turbo button. With the wiring done, I tested the stick using the OLED display to make sure I connected everything correctly, before screwing the plexiglass in place. I stuck on 4 low-profile rubber feet and called it done. Overall, it was quite an enjoyable process and build. And as I said at the start, I'm super happy with the results. Let's have a quick look at the total cost for this build. Man, that Osmo Top Oil sure is expensive. Mainly because, I had to buy a liter in total, which is roughly 50 times more than I actually needed for this build. And to be fair, I should probably add $10 or so to the final price because I did buy a few boxes of like small screws and PCB standoffs. But otherwise, this is actually what I paid for this. Anyway, let's leave it at this. I hope you liked it and that it inspires you to try out building something similar. If you have any questions on anything, just let me know in the comments and I'll reply as soon as I can.